let me ask you about Joseph Smith's first vision. A lot of people are troubled by the different, and you don't have to give long answers.
Yeah.
You can give us the short answer first, and then if I want to dig deeper, you can, because there's a lot of classic apologetic answers to these, these dilemmas.
Yeah.
With Joseph Smith's first vision and the varying accounts, what's the category of your reconciliation of that problem?
Well, I'm personally fine with an amount of ambiguity as to what actually happened. So yeah, we do have like the 1838 canonized account, right? But I'm not opposed just because I accept scriptures like the Bible and other texts within Mormonism. I'm not opposed at looking at stories or events for inspiration, but also understanding that there can be differences in those accounts. So like this isn't exactly analogous to the first vision, but within Mormonism, within the standard works, or within our LDS experience, we have 4 different accounts of the creation narrative. We have one in Genesis. Arguably, there's 2 in Genesis, but there's one in Genesis. There's one in the Book of Abraham. There's one in Moses, and then there's one in the temple as well. All of them have different details and have different takes. Some of them have elements that contradict other ones, and yet we are okay having all of those in the same, within the same faith and approaching all of them and kind of drawing from all of them. So I would say in a way, that's how I go about with Joseph's experience as well. Like, I do believe that he had an experience with divinity, or with deity in the grove. I feel like the emphasis or kind of the takeaways from that experience changed for him throughout his life, where early on it was more a matter of personal repentance, and then later there was more of an emphasis or focus on authority once kind of the church had been established. And there's ways we could talk about how memory works and things like that. But I'm not uncomfortable with the different accounts, but I don't seek to make them fit or align, if that makes sense. Like, I don't feel the need to have them all line up and not contradict each other. I'm comfortable with certain elements being contradictory or not feeling like they can fit all the way, because I'm comfortable with accepting other things in my faith as well that, doesn't align in a perfect way either. I can certainly say I've had powerful spiritual experiences that, while they're certainly not theophanies, right? The way I think about them and would write about them now is very much dependent on my individual experience now. And it would be different than how I would write about them when I was 14 years old or, 12 years old or something like that. They've kind of developed, and it's not that I'm lying now or I'm deceiving now when I talk about them, or, that I was when I was 14 or 12 or, whatever. It's just, I communicate them differently. Certain elements change, and certainly different way. I remember them in certain ways too. So I'm not uncomfortable with different first vision accounts. At least that's what I'll say.
Okay. How about the idea that that the witnesses to the Book of Mormon weren't super credible, that that they followed James Strang, and some talked about experiencing things with their spiritual eyes. What do you make of the credibility of the witnesses versus those who would say they really don't, their credibility really doesn't support the restoration narrative?
Yeah. Well, it is kind of an individual case with each one, because I would certainly hold some as more credible than others, maybe. But yeah, I mean, I believe the witnesses. I don't know that their testimonies of what took place are like the only reason that I believe in the existence of gold plates, but certainly the fact that there's individuals who step forward who have claimed to see an angel, that Joseph Smith had appear to them, claimed to feel the plates, even beyond the witnesses too. There's quite a few. I generally would accept them. Again, that's not the sole reason why I accept it, but it gives me more comfort than just taking it on Joseph's word alone, because at least then I can take it on other individuals' words as well. So, you could certainly say that Martin Harris was maybe wishy-washy throughout his life or things like that. And I think there's
and the Whitmer brothers.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that they would testify that James Strang's scripture that he produced was also scripture,
mm-hmm.
Doesn't that, for you, call into question? Also, you've got Oliver Cowdery testifying that Joseph Smith committed adultery.
Yeah.
You've got Sidney Rigdon parting from Brigham Young and going in a very different direction.
It's definitely very complex, right? And so again, like I see these individuals as following, or living what they thought was definitely true. In the case of James Strang, I think there was a certain point in time when an individual who was one of his witnesses just owned up to the fact that it was fraudulent or whatever. I do know that most of the Smith family stayed behind with James Strang, or at least Lucy Max Smith and some other early witnesses. Did they sign affidavits that Strang was the rightful successor or something like that?
Yeah.
I don't know. It was something like that, right?
I get it. Here's a way to ask the question. If Oliver Cowdery's credible as a witness of the Book of Mormon, is he credible when he says Joseph Smith was an adulterer?
I certainly believe that he thought that Joseph Smith was an adulterer, and that's something that he struggled with. And whether or not Joseph Smith was committing adultery, I think is up for debate. It wouldn't be corrosive to my view of him as a prophet if indeed some of his relationships were inappropriate, right? And so I make room for that. I actually think Joseph Smith did make mistakes when it comes to polygamy. I'm not opposed to polygamy per se, but definitely the way that it was carried out and the way that, hiding it from Emma and stuff like that, that's not something that I feel I should be defending or should be defended, right?
So do you see polygamy as a mistake, one of those mistakes that you mentioned previously?
I'm open to the idea that it was legitimate and revealed of God.
Are you open to the idea that it was a mistake?
Yeah, I mean, I could be. That's not where I'm at. But if it turns out,
where are you in terms of your belief in polygamy?
I do believe that it was commanded, and I just think the execution was terrible, and that it wasn't practiced in a way that was always the best.
So you still believe in D&C 132?
Yeah, I would say so. I kind of.
And you don't see polygamy as just fundamentally sexist and disrespectful to women and corrosive to society.
Corrosive to society. I think that could be argued. I think polygamy is definitely one of those institutions that's easy and susceptible to abuse. But earlier when I was talking about like my views on marriage and how they're kind of libertarian, like when you have consenting individuals who want to enter into relationships, I don't see it as my place to be like, you can and you can't. I'm just living my life, right? But so if it's consensual, if a woman is okay with it, I would. If polygamy, if we could do a do-over of polygamy, I wouldn't want polygamy not to have happened necessarily. Like it's not polygamy that's the problem. It's just how it was lived out and executed.
Many people do see it as deeply problematic, but it's reasonable for you to feel differently, obviously. Certainly you feel like the pressure on underage girls and the pressure on parents to give their children to Joseph, the polyandry where Joseph's marrying other men's wives. Are those problems for you? Like I said, I think the execution was at times pretty messy, especially when Joseph was hiding it from Emma. I would have liked to see things go otherwise. In terms of how we interpret these marriages or sealings, right? Some people go about it in more of a dynastic sense.
I think sealing power is actually can be pretty dynamic. So I'm not opposed actually to sealing power really being used to seal individuals together, not in the same manner as Joseph necessarily did, but I don't see Joseph as using polygamy for purely sexual reasons. I'm not someone who is closed off to the idea that sex was involved in polygamy. I just don't think that was the focus. I like Richard Bushman's kind of take that, and this is kind of a paraphrase, but Joseph Smith didn't lust so much after women as he lusted after kin. Like I see these marriages and I see these like connections between families being formed as something that when practiced right has a potential to bring people closer together in kind of meaningful symbolic ways. But certainly when there's pressure involved or
like with polyandry,
mm-hmm.
why was he marrying other men's wives versus marrying other men and their wives? Why was he just marrying the wives who were already married?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think Joseph was pretty much the only one that did polyandry in early Mormon history. I can't think of any other apostles or leaders that practiced that as well. So, a lot of
it's a big question mark for you.
Yeah. So, for the most part, it's a question mark, and it's something that I'm still enjoying reading about and kind of getting more familiar with. So
why in your mind, why underage girls?
The underage thing isn't so much a problem for me because it wasn't considered underage at the time necessarily.
I think it was. I think 14, 15-year-olds was underage for a 30 whatever year old man.
Maybe socially, but legally, I don't think it was because in that same year, and maybe it varied by state as well. But Edgar Allan Poe married, his like 14-year-old cousin in pretty much the same year. So I think definitely it was the exception. But with parental permission, as in the case of Heber C. Kimball's daughter, there's certain ways that you could go about it to where it wasn't illegal.
Right. I wasn't saying illegal. I was saying sort of like viewed as weird or strange, right?
Yeah.
Or
no, I certainly recognize
abnormal.
that. Mm-hmm.
What about Joseph entering into a relationship with Fanny Alger before the sealing power was even given?
Yeah, see, that's something that I have an issue with, and that I think was a bad move on Joseph's part. I don't necessarily claim to know the full history behind all that. I'm really enjoying Lindsay Hansen Park's podcast, Year of Polygamy, and reading different things up on polygamy. But certainly, I think that's one of those messier elements that is especially when Emma felt so betrayed by it that if it ended up being something that was adulterous in nature, right, or wasn't executed in the right way, I'm not opposed to that possibility. Again, it's kind of a question mark for me now.
And don't you agree that Emma wasn't sealed to Joseph until like his 20-something wife? Like even the DNC says that the first wife with the law of Sarah needs to approve subsequent wives. So in some sense, Joseph was disobeying his own revelation, right?
Yeah, a lot of it was really messy. It's a mess. Most of it is a mess, right?
Okay, so you think that was wrong for Joseph to lie to Emma and to wait until she's like the 22nd wife to actually get sealed to her, with 21 other wives being secretly married to before his actual first wife. Doesn't that seem kind of insulting?
Yeah, no, it certainly seems, like I said, like it wasn't executed in an ideal way if that was even supposed to take place.
Okay, that's fair. I appreciate you taking kind of those hard questions.
Yeah, if I can elaborate a little bit on DNC 132, just textually, that revelation stands out differently than a lot of other revelations do, and the fact that what's the version we have in our canon for 132 is pretty much the exact same version, I believe, that was initially written down. Most of the other revelations in Doctrine and Covenants were kind of edited or redacted or kind of cleaned up a little bit. Like Joseph would take several days with them to kind of refine them or polish them before bringing them forth to the saints. And I think the version we have for 132 is in kind of an unpolished version. So that document stands apart from other documents in the Doctrine and Covenants in the sense that it didn't undergo the same type of refinement. So part of me has to wonder, I certainly don't see it as directly applicable to my life today, but I have to wonder just how much of it was legitimate, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Some people, you use the term messy to describe Joseph's implementation of polygamy. Miles notes and others would, I was feeling this too. Mm-hmm. Messy seems like kind of like a euphemism, a nice way to describe it. Some would describe it as abusive or deceitful, right? Yeah. The fact that these little 14-year-old girls are told, accept my offer for eternal marriage now, or, you and your family will lose eternal blessings. The disparity in power between Joseph and mm-hmm. these little teenage girls. Even D&C 132, where he's telling Emma she'll be damned immediately if she doesn't accept polygamy. That's not just, or just marrying other men's wives and sending men to foreign countries and then propositioning their wives. That's not just messy. In today's standards, that would be scandalous. It would be heinous. It would be horrendous, abusive, etc.
It would be FLDS.
Yeah. So, I mean, can you do a little processing about why you're just calling it messy? So when if I did those things, you would call me disgusting and abominable and egregious and, way worse adjectives, right?
Yeah. Well, first off, like the history itself sometimes is messy. I mean, just in terms of the particulars in a lot of these, there's disagreement between scholars who are knowledgeable on polygamy, on how it was exactly practiced. I mean, you're gonna find Carolyn Pearson disagreeing with Brian Hales, disagreeing with Lindsay Hansen Park. Individuals who have read a lot of the same documents are going to make different conclusions on it. And so the history itself isn't always clear as to what is taking place and how these people are seeing it. I generally enjoy, or I generally just make an effort to really highlight the voices of the individuals in question. So when I can, when we are discussing whether or not abuse is taking place, are the individuals themselves viewing it as abusive? So like the plural wives themselves, what are their voices saying? Let's have them speak for themselves to kind of get some insight as to how they're feeling. And I think that doesn't always paint as awful as a picture as sometimes it appears to be, right? So in the case of Heber C. Kimball's daughter, her memoirs and her writings on polygamy and plural marriage stayed fairly favorable. And, a lot of these individuals that we might want to label as victims later in life didn't label themselves as victims either, So I'm not saying that to say that there was no harm done in the first place, but certainly I think their voices are worth listening to and kind of taking as part of the equation when we are discussing how much pressure was actually on them. Was it inappropriate? Did they feel abused? Was there abuse? That's what I mean by messy. There's a lot of ways we can approach these things. There's a lot of different perspectives, and there's a lot of data to kind of make sense of it all. And not all the times is the data in full agreement either, because you have contradictory voices in that same period who interpret the same events differently or recall things in different ways. So that's what I mean by messy. I'm not using it as necessarily a euphemism for something that I'm just putting on the shelf and I'm just going to ignore. Like I said, I'm actively reading about this stuff so I can get better clarity on it, because I'll be the first to recognize that I'm definitely not an authority on these matters. So if there's any if the way that I explain my current thinking, I recognize there's room for development, and I'm looking for that development. And so, it's a process for
I
me.
think that's super mature and thoughtful of you, and I applaud it.
Yeah.
What about Joseph's destruction of the printing press? Do you sort of think that was a mistake?
Again, this is another point where people make the argument that he was either justified or not justified. I mean, certainly the justification he gave was that the Mormon expositor, it was disturbing the peace. I've read that edition of the Mormon expositor because we do have like some type of record of what it said in that first edition. I think it was the only edition that was ever printed. So I'm not opposed to the idea that was an abuse of power on Joseph's part, which is all too possible when you're setting up kind of a democratic theocracy. There's aspects of Joseph's governance in the Nauvoo period that I absolutely love. The Council of 50, the new documents that have come forth from that, and the way that scholars are able to access them. There's some great stuff in there that I absolutely love, and that was very refreshing to see in that council. Joseph going out of his way to include non-Mormons as part of it, and to make sure their voices are included, to stand up for religious liberty, things like that. There's some great stuff that goes on. At the same time, if part of the destroying the printing press was an abuse of his power, I certainly recognize that it was by destroying the press that Joseph ended up in Carthage in the first place. That was like one of the main reasons. So I kind of pushed back against the narrative that he was imprisoned solely on the basis of religious belief. I think the persecution,
or just for persecution, right?
Yeah, I think some of the persecution that took place in that time was self-inflicted, by mistakes that Joseph made. Certainly, I think people were religiously antagonistic towards Mormons, and on the basis of belief did persecute them. But at the same time, there's a lot more complexity than just writing it off as fully religious persecution. So, part of Joseph being in Carthage, I think, was partly his own fault.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective.
Yeah.
Let's turn to Book of Mormon. In your mind, were gold plates delivered by an angel to Joseph Smith?
I would believe that.
And the characters like Moroni and Mormon and Helaman and Nephi, were they actual historical figures that lived, somewhere in the Americas between 600 BC and 400 AD?
Yeah, I would hold to Book of Mormon historicity.
Okay. And then, so how do you think about anachronisms?
So I recently listened to your podcast interview with Brant Gardner a while back. Have
you heard the one with Michael Coe before you talk about Brant Gardner?
He's the Yale professor.
Yep.
I read that, and I read Sorensen's response to that, and I've done quite a bit of back and forth on Book of Mormon historicity in general, between farms and those who critique Book of Mormon historicity. So I wouldn't say there's a smoking gun against Book of Mormon historicity, but there's certainly nothing that I can point to and be like, this definitively proves that the Book of Mormon is historical. I recognize there's elements that I hold to a functional translation rather than a literal translation. So functional in the sense that when I was talking about Revelation earlier, like Joseph is very much interjecting his own voice in the narrative as well, or expressing it in language that he's familiar with. I mean, certainly, you have the presence of the King James Bible in there, and certainly you can point to similarities in kind of sermons or speeches from let's say King Benjamin, different revivalist preachers in Joseph's same area. There's certain elements that are 19th century, but there's other ones too that I think speak towards historicity. So I hold to kind of a functional model of the translation where it is based in a historical record. It is based in a history, but the translation itself includes influence from Joseph Smith and includes 19th century elements as well. So
how does that square with the idea that he would see the words written while he was looking in the hat, and then he would say what he read, and then those things would be written down? Also, if he can create Kurlam and Kubamam, which are words that had no meaning,
we don't know. Yeah.
How can it be both that he was reading the words and dictating them, and that he was adding in all his own cultural artifacts and influences?
Mm-hmm. As far as that quote goes, I think the only source that we get that from is might be from one of the Whitmers. And it's not that I don't trust that. It's just that I don't know how he became pertinent to that information in the first place. I don't think he ever says that. You have a lot of people, I guess, describing what happened in the translation process, right? But Joseph himself, the only thing he ever says on the matter is that it took place by the gift and power of God, right? And so in all these different models, even my model for how I kind of make sense of it and how it took place, like I recognize I'm not in the hat with Joseph. I'm not there, experiencing that process with him. And so I can't speak authoritatively as to what took place. I'm only expressing what appears to take place. And so I hold similar views to like Brant Gardner or Blake Ostler, or, I think most Mormon apologists would, where it is both ways, and it's not necessarily problematic because that's just reflective on the revelatory experience in the first place.
So you're saying sometimes he read words and dictated, and then other times he just sort of channeled it?
Maybe. I mean, I don't know as the particulars, and I don't know if any of us can really know. I don't know if I'm correct, if David Whitmer was the one who described it in that way. I don't know if he fully knew. All we know really is just that Joseph said it took place by the gift and power of God. And so as far as the rest of it goes, we can make propositions based off what appears in the text and what appears to be taking place. So yeah, I mean, I see elements that look ancient. I see elements that I recognize as like 19th century influence, and it's not necessarily problematic. So I would just recommend listening to Brant Gardner's podcast again for anyone who wants a better sense of what I'm talking about, because he definitely expressed it better than I can.
So if somebody were to say, Jaxon, that you're basically saying the witnesses are credible when they support a story or a narrative that matches what the church kind of is wanting people to believe, but as soon as the witnesses support a narrative that's different, then we tend to want to discard their narrative. So again, if it was David Whitmer, you're saying he's a reliable witness when it comes to testifying that the plates existed. But if David Whitmer says, I don't remember Joseph Smith ever restoring a Melchizedek priesthood, or if Martin Harris follows the Strangs, or if David Whitmer says, well, he dictated what he saw in the hat, can you acknowledge that you're kind of picking and choosing the statements from the witnesses that match the story you want told, and kind of being willing to dismiss them when they don't match the story you want to be told?
I'd like to see it as I'm taking it more on a case-by-case basis, because the reason I'm comfortable kind of relying on the joint testimonies of individuals who say they held the plates physically or saw an angel, and they describe a lot of the same, they describe the same thing personally happening to them. That's one thing. I think David Whitmer or whoever gave that quote, saying that this is what Joseph saw in the hat, I don't know if he was there to witness that. You know what I'm saying? Like, the reason Joseph's face is in the hat is because it's him alone that's seeing this. So if anything, at best, one would have to take that as a secondhand account that David Whitmer got from Joseph describing how that took place. That's not David Whitmer seeing that himself. All he's seeing is, if he's there, is hat, face in the hat. So I mean, I don't personally feel like I'm cherry picking, if that makes sense. But but I can certainly see how individuals might see that. When it comes to things about like Melchizedek priesthood or things like that, did you say someone in particular claims that they didn't remember that? Was that David Whitmer as well?
My understanding is that David Whitmer produced a pamphlet after he sort of parted ways.
Yeah.
And basically said by 1838, Joseph was like introducing things into his narrative when his authority was being challenged that he never talked about prior. So there's a reason why we don't have a date for the Melchizedek priesthood.
Yeah.
It's because it was never talked about until, as I understand it, around 1838 when Joseph's authority was being questioned. And so, David Whitmer saying Joseph is making this up later, that was never a part of the original restoration. Faithful Mormons now, they're willing to accept David Whitmer's testimony that he saw the plates, but reject his perspective that Joseph was introducing teachings afterwards that were never really a part of it to begin with, right?
And I think for the most part, individuals would probably do that just because they're seeing David come at things from an antagonistic viewpoint, because he is trying to discredit Joseph at that time with that pamphlet you're talking about on terms of his veracity as a prophet. Or I think at that time he's trying to say that Joseph has fallen, So I think individuals are, at least from the church, they either write him off because of that, or at least they're hesitant to put a lot of weight on what he's saying because of that. So yeah, I mean, I don't have a definitive answer to that, but
okay, that's cool. So when the Book of Mormon mentions horses, what do you think it's saying there?
I'm not opposed to loan shifting, and I actually don't see loan shifting as a shoddy apologetic sleight of hand.
Tell us what that means.
Loan shifting is essentially individuals who, from one culture, when they enter into another culture and they see something, they attribute a name to that object or subject that's already familiar to them. So we see this happening with the Greeks when they see hippopotami or hippopotamuses. I don't know what the plural for that would be, but essentially calling them river horses. We know a hippopotamus isn't a river horse. To the Greeks, they were using the language, the best of their ability to express what it was. And so, you have calling bison buffalo. You have the conquistadors calling buffalo or bison as like cows, vaca. This is something that happens, and I think there is a strong case to be put forward that it could be happening in the Book of Mormon. So I don't see it. Like I'm totally willing to call out shoddy apologetic arguments. I don't see this one as shoddy. I think it has some substance to it, and it should be taken into the equation. So
wheat and steel and swords and helmets and chariots and all that stuff. Do you basically just say that's all loan shifting?
I think it depends. So much of these are particular to the instance that we're talking about too. I mean, horses aren't talked about a whole lot in the Book of Mormon. Neither is steel. And chariots only have like 2 mentions, once in an Isaiah chapter and another, I think, with King Laman or Lamoni, whatever his name is.
Still, if an iPod was mentioned in the Book of Mormon text, we'd know it was false.
Yeah. No. Yeah, that would certainly be shifty. But some of these things we have seen evidence for in Mesoamerica. Others are still pretty up in the air. I think it's just a more complex conversation than whether or not it was there. I think Farms has done some good work on kind of making a case for why these things are not as black and white as we might sometimes want them to be. Like, even though it'd be great to see horses, there's not horses. Okay, what could that maybe be meaning? I guess what I'm saying is, like, in my view of the Book of Mormon in general, it's not problematic to me, and I'm not opposed to the idea that this is something that could be discovered in the future, or that was just inserted either as loan shifting by the ancient authors or is Joseph influencing the text more than maybe even I hold.
So just to kind of cut to the chase, that'll probably address a lot of issues. Yes, we could take anachronisms and deal with it, or we could take DNA and deal with it, or we could take the lack of archaeological evidence, the bones and the remains that we're just not finding in North America, or even Central America, or a geography, or the remnants of language, or again, the archaeological evidence that would support it. But then also, you've got the fact that the Book of Abraham wasn't translated apparently correctly. You've got the DNA evidence problem with the Book of Mormon. You have to admit, Jaxon, that yes, we could debate in isolation any one of these issues, but if you add them all in aggregate, plus the fact that so much of the Book of Mormon was taken from the Bible, the New Testament, the Old Testament, so many of the errors that were in versions of the Bible that Joseph Smith had access to, those errors appear in the Book of Mormon. Stuff from Isaiah was being quoted that hadn't even happened yet, that was out of time sync. Can you acknowledge that when you add all this evidence together, that the Book of Mormon is deeply problematic as a historical document?
Yeah, I think certainly, and I'm speaking from my own experience, right? So I recognize that individuals, when they see this whole mass of criticisms or problems or things like that, things that don't make sense, it can be overwhelming. And for many people, it is the more rational direction to, not continue believing in it, right? So, I recognize that. I want to validate that. I would just encourage individuals to, in looking at this aggregate mass, right, be willing to go through each one and see, kind of the different voices and really just whatever speaks to you and whatever makes sense to you, right? Whatever seems plausible, and where the evidence leads you. That's what I would say, you should. I'm fine with individuals ending up with. So this is just where I'm at, right? I do, just like I recognize 19th century elements, I'm recognizing things that you're saying. I recognize like things that appear ancient in origin, or have some type of basis in the ancient world. I mean, I just wrote a final paper for one of my religion classes that was kind of viewing parts of First Nephi and putting it in context with the ancient world. I guess what I'll say is, while there are things that make me kind of like, raise my eyebrow and be like, what the heck, like that doesn't make full sense. There's other things where I'm like, wow, that actually makes a lot of sense, and it seems to fit very well. So at the end of the day, when I combine the things that are, that appear to be very surprising that I wouldn't expect the Book of Mormon to have in terms of accuracy, and then other ones that seem to be a little bit off, this is just how I make sense of it all, and I just move forward in this direction. So, I recognize it, it's very complex. It takes a lot of time to think through, and my conclusions aren't the same as other individuals' conclusions. So
I appreciate that.
I get that.
I guess I just think it's important to recognize that it's not, are you willing to acknowledge that there are likely social and, psychological forces that make you feel like it's very advantageous to maintain your belief. And so regardless of the evidence that's heaped up, your desire and your social context in many ways just really, makes you feel like you want to believe. And so you are going to just do a real you're going to put a real weight into this sort of sense of confirmation bias, where you are going to, whether intentionally or unintentionally, dismiss the evidence against the Book of Mormon and give more weight to the evidence in support of the Book of Mormon, because in the end, that's the conclusion that you want to arrive at. Are you willing to acknowledge that's likely, a good heavy sense of influence on the conclusion you've arrived at?
Yeah, I mean, I would be wrong if I said I was free of confirmation bias, or if I was free of, a lot of these psychological or social factors that you kind of put into the equation. I think no one is free of things like that. So I do factor that into the equation, and I try and counter that by actively challenging different aspects of my belief, and remaining open to dialogue and continuing this process. Like I say, I've said before, I recognize this as a journey, as a development. So where I'm at now isn't necessarily where I will be at down the road. And I recognize that. And so, that's the best that I can do to kind of help myself in this process, be free of, not necessarily be free, but do my best to avoid just giving in to social expectations or things like that. Because, if I did, and if I really did want things to be all cozy and comfortable, I wouldn't be talking to you. I wouldn't be reading a lot of things. I wouldn't continue this journey and still recognize that I'm not yet at the final destination. So I think that's the best thing I can do. And again, I just want to emphasize that I'm being personally authentic to what I feel, where I feel I'm at the moment, in terms of rational belief and spiritual experience and how they meld together. My identity is determined by what I've experienced and kind of the way I've thought about these things. And I recognize just that could change in the future. So, that's the best I can do, so I just ask for charity from individuals who might be looking into this process, because I'm 19 years old, and a lot of individuals who I've spoken to that have gone through crises of faith, it happens to them in their 30s or 40s, or after decades of maybe wrestling with these questions. So I definitely don't want to come across as some spunky little apologist kid who thinks he has the world all figured out. That's not my intention. And I'm just trying to do my best with what I have and be authentic with myself. And, I recognize I'm on a journey too. So hopefully when individuals listen to even this interview, they can recognize that and make room for my views to change in the future if such takes place.
I love it. And that's why I think you deserve so much respect and kudos and credit for being willing to face these questions, to face such scrutiny, especially at such a young age, and with an audience that would be inclined to attack and dismiss and deride what you're doing. So I appreciate you taking the tough questions and your sincerity and openness and humility as well.
Thank you.
Okay. So I assume that with Book of Abraham, it's this idea that he wasn't really translating, but instead he was channeling inspiration, but not really translating. Is that kind of how you view the Book of Abraham? I
mean, really the two main schools of thought that I think most LDS scholars have nowadays is either one along the lines of a catalyst theory, that the papyri served as a catalyst for revelation, or some that hold to the belief of extra room on the missing scroll. I've read up on the debate on whether or not there was sufficient room for a legitimate Book of Abraham text to be on the scroll. There's a back and forth between John Gee and some individuals who published an article in Dialogue. A lot of it is just much too mathematical for me, so I do kind of closet that because I just don't know. I'm not good enough to figure out these calculations or verify them, or I don't have enough training to really feel confident in determining who's right in that. So I would lean towards a catalyst theory, if anything. So that, but this is definitely something that's in development. I got John Gee's latest book, Introduction to the Book of Abraham, for my birthday, and I read it, and I was a little bit underwhelmed by it. To be honest, a little bit disappointed. I was hoping for a little bit more meat in it, and I guess I should have taken the title a little bit more seriously at an introduction. because it truly is an introduction. And, while it is concise and kind of deals with a lot of the complexities, it doesn't offer any definitive arguments that I feel can be used to further the conversation. It's just a good overview. So yeah, still figuring that out, still thinking about that. And I think a lot of the LDS scholarly community at large is still grappling with the complexities of history and, some of this data. So I'm, just continuing with that too.
Well, I really appreciate your candor there as well. So thank you. Okay. Any other kind of major, truth claim sort of issues that you've studied that you want to kind of take a position on? Did we cover most of the big ones?
Yeah, I mean, we covered most of the big ones, just kind of how I approach scripture and revelation and things like that. I can say things that I find very appealing in Mormonism is that, at least in my experience, I feel like I can find and include elements of other faiths that I think are true and that bring meaning to my life, and I can include that as part of my Mormon experience. I've never gotten pushback from members of the church. Actually, wait, there was one very weird person online who said I shouldn't be doing interfaith type stuff, who said he was a member. That's the only individual I've ever gotten pushback about interfaith stuff with. My interfaith experiences have been very enriching for me. It's actually one of the times I feel the Spirit most is in settings of interfaith, where multiple religions are gathered together, in harmony and things like that. That's really when I feel God's love a lot. As far as Mormon truth claims, I think we covered the main ones in terms of like restoration and some of the unique doctrines. I'll just reiterate, I really like the idea of theosis or Mormon exaltation. And I really find the unique Mormon understanding of the ontology of God and man to be very, very appealing to me. So there's elements that I would approach in maybe a Terrell Givens way, where it's just the fact that I find beauty in them, that I choose to incorporate them as part of my life and identity, or that I feel like I can rally around that. So there's definitely elements of Mormonism that I find immense beauty in, and that's why I rally around it.
Yeah, your testimony is based on what? I haven't even asked you that yet. Have you had spiritual experiences or prayer? Or
I have. I've never had a singular experience where, in a Joseph Smith type way, or maybe a standard member type way, where, I ask if the church is true and I just get this overwhelming feeling that I can never shake, it's always just been progressive. It's always been a developmental experience where, as I read more, as I wrestle with these problems more, eventually, one by one, I felt kind of a sense of comfort or peace with them, where they're not as front and center anymore, but instead I feel like I'm able to adopt a perspective that I'm comfortable with, I am authentic with, and that makes sense to me. And so really my testimony has been won over by lots of study and lots of contemplation and just kind of thinking about these issues. And so it's been a rational process. It has been a spiritual process. I have had certain experiences which have really changed the way that I see things, that have colored the lenses that I see the world through, that are kind of distinctly Mormon in nature. And I can't really help but have those experiences change the way that I see the world. They act as kind of filters or lenses. I would shake them if I could, but the fact is, I've experienced it, and I'm just inviting more experience, so I can continue to see things in different ways. So yeah, it's based off spiritual experiences. It's based off me thinking about it a lot, but there's never been a singular time where I felt my testimony confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt or something like that. One
of the biggest questions you got from our listeners was, this idea of basing religious beliefs on feelings is just not at face value reliable, because everyone who believes any religious system bases their beliefs on feelings, and feelings apparently can lead two different people in two different directions that are opposing and non-reconcilable. So people just want to ask you, how are feelings a reliable basis for any sort of belief, really?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I talk about these experiences I've had and how I can't help but have them kind of serve as lenses for how I see things. That's something that isn't so much on feelings, but in terms of experiences. I would kind of flip the question back at, an individual who might see feelings or experiences as not as something we should be wary of, because many people, it's when their shelf breaks that they feel validation for leaving Mormonism, either in spiritual or rational ways, right? I see, at least for my testimony, I don't base my testimony just on feelings. And I don't think just feelings or just spiritual experiences necessarily is a full epistemic model that an individual can use to arrive at absolute truth. That seems to kind of be synonymous with fideism, which I do recognize is not a reliable model. That's why, at least in my experience, I've gone out of my way to make sure I'm studying, but then I'm also engaging in a spiritual manner. So it's both a spiritual and a rational process for me, rather than just a fully emotional or feelings-based process. And you'll notice too, like, still, when it comes to affirmations of religious belief, I'm not claiming to have absolute knowledge on a lot of these matters. I'm still leaving a lot of things up in the air, ultimately, to where I make room that I could be indeed wrong. That's why I think the best thing that any of us can do is just live our lives based off the knowledge we have, and be open to our changing views in terms of rational and spiritual approaches to these things. I do believe that spirituality is kind of inherent in human beings. I don't think that's something that we can shake. I don't think the religious impulse in humanity is something that any of us can transcend. And so I think that even for individuals who claim to have left religion altogether and are the staunchest of atheists or kind of logical positivists, right? I still think that religious impulses, the religious instinct, is something that's inherent in the human experience, and that's still going to affect us, whether or not we recognize that. But that becomes more of a religious studies or a philosophy type question than something I can completely answer within my Mormon faith. But I do feel comfortable with my approach. At the end of the day, I just feel like I'm going about life in an honest manner as I can. I'm open to spirituality. I am, making a rational effort to figure things out, and I'm just trying to approach my human experience in the most human way possible. And so I'm not going to close myself off to something that's been very natural and consistent with humanity, which is religious or spiritual engagement and experience. If I just for the sake of wanting to not be biased, wrote off my experiences, my spiritual or religious experiences, I would feel not authentic doing that. I would feel like I wouldn't be doing wouldn't be doing myself a favor by doing that. I would feel less of Jaxon than, fully Jaxon, so these are just things that I can't personally help. But to have experienced and have currently cloud or kind of shade my own perspective on things. I don't think I'm not claiming to be using these things to establish like scientific principles or things like that, right? I think the scientific method is good for for matters of science. When it comes to spirituality, though, that's just much more subjective, and I don't think it should be written off completely. But at the same time, I think it should be coupled with a rational effort on the part of the individual.
I think that was a beautiful and sophisticated way to conclude this segment. So I just want to applaud you for it.
Thank you.
Because it shows a level of sophistication and grace and thoughtfulness that I think most of us don't have, let alone as a 19-year-old. So I'm going to do something that I really don't want to do, but it's just the right place to do it. That's where we should end the interview for this segment, and then start a new one. But there's a couple follow-up questions people asked about Book of Abraham. I just want to quickly run them by you before we end this portion. So Mark writes that this is about the Book of Abraham, written by Abraham's own hand, does not conform with the catalyst theory. Miles writes, the catalyst theory falls flat when you realize the revelation literally references the diagrams. And then Rex writes that even some of the most conservative Bible scholars doubt that Abraham ever existed. Mm-hmm. How can the catalyst theory be true and the claim that Joseph Smith made that the papyrus was written by Abraham's own hand?
Well, I think pseudepigrapha plays into it, and this is something that Richard Bushman mentioned recently at a conference that was held at, I think it was like
Utah State.
Yeah, Utah State. Again, I'm not trying to make an effort.
Meaning Joseph falsely attributed to Abraham. Is that what you're saying?
Either that or the inspiration. Yeah. I'm comfortable with that. I'm not opposed to accepting pseudepigrapha as part of my scriptural canon. I think I've already accepted pseudepigrapha in the form of different parts of the Bible that are attributed to certain individuals, but in fact were written by other individuals. I'm not opposed to that. So that's not problematic to me.
What about Joseph actually trying to translate the diagrams, the facsimiles, and all the mistranslations of the facsimile? That pretty much ties Joseph to the actual text of the papyrus, right? Yeah, no,
I'm certainly not denying that with the facsimiles that he didn't believe that he was translating them. The issue is, what kind of translation are we talking about Joseph doing in the first place? Because I don't think there was ever a day where Joseph did a translation, at least within Mormon history, that was truly a translation in the conventional sense. The Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham, the translation of the Bible, all of these instances where we use the word translation, they're used in a sense that no one ever uses the word translation in, so it's just so ambiguous and up in the air that I don't think treating the Book of Abraham as a direct translation in the same manner maybe as the Book of Mormon is the right way to go, because Joseph was just all over the place with when he was using the word translation. There's a lot of ambiguity.
I can understand that, and I hope you would agree that Joseph clearly thought that he was translating, and when he said translating, he thought he meant translating, and in a
conventional sense.
Well, he's basically telling people he can read Egyptian and that he's a prophet and a seer and a revelator, and that he's even with the Book of Mormon, he's talking about seeing the characters on in the golden plates, and then providing English version of whatever those words mean. Like you have to admit that it's tricky that on the one hand he says written by the hand of Abraham. He says he's translating. He uses the word translation, even describes the process in ways, or others describe the process in ways that literally mean translation. And when he reads the facsimiles, he's interpreting them very explicitly, and he's even writing out in Egyptian grammar and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And then you're saying, oh, well, the word doesn't mean what we think it means. It really wasn't translation. It was something else. If I had tried to pull this off, and if I had gotten a papyrus, and if I had claimed to translate it, and people said, Jaxon, well, is Jean Delin a prophet? Look at what he produced. You would write me off as a fraud because you would trust Egyptologists in that case, and you would say, well, John was just making it up. Can't you just acknowledge that your unwillingness to use the word translation as it really means your willingness to sort of invoke pseudepigrapha, other fancy highfalutin words, really is this sort of active sheer will to just want the narrative to still be true. When tons of evidence, if applied to any other person in any other context where you didn't have, religious beliefs that were inherited from your parents and your upbringing, you would never let those sorts of things fly. And I'm not trying to say you're wrong. I'm just saying, can you acknowledge that that's kind of what it appears that you're doing?
Yeah, no, and again, like
with the book.
If it appears that also that I'm not putting forth the best defense of this type of stuff too, I don't have any materials beforehand or kind of expertise in the particulars of these things. So I do look to individuals like Richard Bushman and individuals who get into more of the history. And I will admit that some of the conclusions that I have are because I am appealing to an authority figure that I feel is more qualified than I am to study these things and interpret them, and we do that with scholarship and whatnot.
Secular people do that too, to be fair. We all do that,
so
right?
I really can't get into the nitty gritty at the moment. I do see how for individuals on the outside, how again it's not implausible to think that I am highly influenced by my environment and by things that I would like to be true. That's not something I can consciously help, I think, beyond more than what I'm currently doing.
Yeah. Okay.
Just more study, more thought, and just more living life, right? That's just my plan for now until someone shows me something better that I can do besides just suspend, put all my experiences and my beliefs and perspectives on complete hold. I don't know if I can really help much more than I am at the current moment.
No, it's beautiful. I appreciate you being a good spirit. I'm not trying to beat you up.
No.
I hope you can understand the spirit from which the questions come.
Of course.
Yeah.